So thank you so much for being with us this evening. As I just said, this is the Pennsylvania Redistricting Lessons Learned and Next Steps for Reform. We are very appreciative of the new maps that we have for this next 10 years. They are far better than the maps that we had for the last several decades. In fact, I've been looking at past redistricting legislation introduced in Harrisburg, and the earliest bill I found was 1983. And from what I've seen so far, there has been at least one bill, often more, in every session since 1983. So for 40 years, Pennsylvanians have been asking for a better legislative process. The earliest ones addressed congressional redistricting, but they very quickly began to address state house and Senate districts as well. And even in the 90s, there was a bill to move this process away from legislators and create an independent commission, a 5-person commission. That bill would have had the majority and minority leaders each choosing one of the commissioners. So that doesn't give a lot of distance from the legislature, but it was a step in that direction. And there have been bills to strengthen criteria since the 1980s, because the criteria for congressional maps is non-existent in Pennsylvania, and the criteria for our state house and Senate maps is very slim and easily ignored. So we are here today to say we are not done on redistricting. We are pleased with better maps, but we know that even the better maps do not always reflect the communities that the maps were drawn for, and that there are places in our maps, that the House and Senate maps, where there were trade-offs made to reflect the choices of legislators rather than the choices of communities. And we also know that if we don't have something in law for the next time, there's no guarantee that the next commission, the next court, the next process will yield maps as good as those we have. We have no guarantee at all. And we were incredibly fortunate this time around to have a very fair and nonpartisan commission chair who hired very fair and nonpartisan staff. And we're fortunate to have one of those with us this evening. But there's nothing that assures us that would be the case again the next time around. So we need reform in law, and we know that changing the process for State House and Senate will require a constitutional amendment, which is a long process in Pennsylvania. So we are starting now. So just so you know, this is the first event that is being co-hosted by the new Pennsylvania Redistricting Table, which is a new gathering of organizations across the state to continue to work on this issue together. The groups that have formed the Pennsylvania Redistricting Table include Pennsylvania Voice, Fair Districts PA, League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, Common Cause Pennsylvania, Committee of 70, Draw the Lines, NAACP of Pennsylvania. We certainly will be welcoming other organizations as we build this process out. And we also have, we are beginning some working groups, and the first working group to get launched actually launched last week, which is a group that will be working on the next bill to be introduced. So taking what's learned tonight, taking what we've learned from the mapping process, taking what's been learned from other states, and making small changes to the bills that we've supported over the last number of years. So that's what we're doing tonight. We're kind of launching the table. We are calling attention to the need for legislative change, legislature that reflects a people-powered mapping process and gives us an independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. That's the introduction. I'm happy that we are going to have as a moderator tonight, Salewa Ogunmefun, who is the executive director of Pennsylvania Voice. Pennsylvania Voice was a strong ally in the citizen mapping process. Fair Districts PA did a people's map for the House and Senate, but it was anchored on the unity maps that Pennsylvania Voice drew with many of their partners. So they did a phenomenal job explaining why this matters to minority communities around the state, and inviting those people to draw their own districts, their own communities. And then that was embedded into our people's map, which we submitted to the Legislative Reapportionment Committee. So they were a strong ally with that. They also were a very strong ally in the work on prison gerrymandering. And it took a lot of work to call attention to the need to reallocate incarcerated people to their home communities. It wasn't a complete win, but it was a pretty strong statement that people should be counted in their home communities, not in the places where they're incarcerated. So thank you, Salewa. Thank you, Pennsylvania Voice. Thank you for all the organizations that are co-hosting tonight. And thank you all for joining us tonight, because this is an important topic. It's not always an easy topic, but it makes a huge difference for Pennsylvania to have better maps now. And we want to have better maps for the future as well. So thank you, Salewa.
Thank you so much, Carol. And it is my absolute pleasure to be able to serve as the host this evening. As Carol mentioned, my name is Salewa Ogunmefun, and I am the Executive Director at Pennsylvania Voice. I'm also joined here this evening by Marisa Pena Rodriguez, our Reflective Democracy Manager at Pennsylvania Voice, and Robbie's mom. Just say hello to everyone, Marisa. And I come from the experience of having the opportunity to work with several of our partners over the last 3 years around a redistricting campaign that we refer to as Maps for the People, where CASA, Amistad Law Project, Make the Road Pennsylvania, One Pennsylvania, Common Cause Pennsylvania, Campus Vote Project, and Action for Climate Emergency worked with their member constituencies, their clients, or the folks that they have conversations with every day on doors to actually talk to folks in the community, hold popular education series, and then ask the communities, how do they draw and define their own lives? And those mapping submissions, we turned into unity maps that really for us represented the interest and the voice of over 700 Pennsylvanians that submitted those maps saying, this is how I draw the boundaries of my own community. This is how I see my life. And this is what my district or my boundaries look like, that we were able to actually turn into those unity maps that Carol spoke about earlier, which was such an amazing experience that really started in 2017 or 2018, when partners of the Pennsylvania Voice Table identified that there were districts across Pennsylvania that had grown to have majority minority populations. Let's look at Reading, Pennsylvania, for example, in Berks County, that hadn't had the representation that matched the populations that actually lived in those areas. And one of the issues that we identified that led to that was the redistricting and the district lines that actually cut across some of these communities in cases. And so realizing that, folks really invested in the census, undergoing the largest non-governmental field program in the country, not knocking on doors, I'm sorry. I'm used to knocking on doors, but it was in COVID. So we were having conversations through so many other different means, but reaching out to folks to ensure that they actually completed the census ahead of the redistricting process so that we started the process with the most accurate and best data possible, which allowed us in the redistricting process to advocate for these communities that we've seen the populations growing of drastically and substantially over the last 30 years. And that led to what I strongly believe, and I'm really excited to hear from the other panelists today, are the most racially equitable state house district maps in Pennsylvania history. And so I will stop talking about the work that we did as Pennsylvania Voice. I am so honored to be able to be joined by such amazing panelists today. And so I'm going to start off by introducing you all to Kathay Feng, who is Common Cause's Vice President of Programs. With more than 2 decades of experience as a voting and civil rights lawyer, Feng is most known for her leadership in redistricting and representation to champion community-centered campaigns to increase public participation, challenge gerrymanders through litigation, and secure fundamental reforms through ballot initiatives and legislative advocacy. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Kathay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, let's see if I can make the share screen work. And okay. So thank you so much for that great introduction. Let's just start by looking at what redistricting looks like around the country. The good news is that around the country, during the last 10 years, there's been actually a lot of states that have adopted new types of reforms. And while I will say a lot of people look at Pennsylvania and say, well, I wish we had those things, I think the one thing is that you can look at what has happened in other states and learn from that, right? So there's a lot of lessons learned. So if we look at that spectrum of red or orangish to green, right? Let's start with the orange states. So the majority of states, 28, have districts that are first and foremost drawn by and approved by or voted into law by their state legislatures, right? Those states, we generally tend to see plans that are adopted that protect incumbents, that protect parties, and sort of entrench power where it is. So to the extent that you have a growing community of color or many communities of color, they tend to not capture that growth because they're really looking at the voters or the constituents that got them there. As we move up the scale of oranges to a lighter orange, there was a number of states, New Mexico and Utah being the most recent, that have what's called an advisory commission, okay? These are generally citizen commissions, right? But they're not the final word on drawing the lines. So we thought that in some states that, that may be the best that they can do because they don't have an initiative process, they have to go through the legislature first. But the biggest challenge is that, in some states like Utah, their commission went around the state, really heard from a lot of people. Problem is that the great map that was proposed, or set of maps that were proposed by the advisory commission, were essentially put through the shredder, and the legislature drew the lines that they really wanted and then adopted those. And we saw that in most of the states that have advisory commissions. The advisory commission maps were not adopted. The legislature just drew the thing that they wanted. Next up is sort of the states that are in kind of a light yellow. There we have states that have it's kind of orangey yellow, politician commissions. So a commission where essentially it's made up of people who are elected, right? And you'll see that Pennsylvania falls into this category. Ohio recently adopted a bunch of changes to their laws, really great rules for redistricting, really identified that partisan gerrymandering was something that they did not want and forbade it. However, ultimately, the entity that was drawing the lines was made up of people who are legislative leaders or other electeds. In Ohio, the legislative leaders drew lines that were then challenged in court 5 times. 5 times the court said these are unconstitutional, they're partisan gerrymanders, but because there was no other group of people other than existing politicians in Ohio, they got stuck with the lines that they got stuck with. So Ohio is sort of a lesson about what can go wrong when you have a politician commission. Moving up the scale to a light green, you have one state, Iowa, that has nonpartisan staff drawing the initial lines, and then the Iowa legislature has to give it an up or down vote. So far, anyways, Iowa is the only state that does this. It's not a bad system, but I will just remind people, if you look at the state of Iowa and you look at their county lines and sort of their population spread, they don't have all their counties are perfect squares, and the population is relatively evenly spread throughout the state. So it means that some of the challenges that other states have, as Pennsylvania does, with a couple different population centers, don't exist in places like Iowa. So it may not be the easiest thing to adopt. Okay, the next 3 up are in shades of green. And let me just point out that the 2 states at the very top, so Michigan and California, that are in dark green, they have what we consider to be a true citizen redistricting commission. So group of citizens who are citizens, they're not chosen by electeds, they're chosen through some other process. They have the final word on drawing the lines. I think it's useful to look at the spectrum because it sort of gives you a sense of like what is possible. Let me just highlight one state, Virginia, which it's in the kind of politician commission category. What they have is a hybrid commission. So 8 people who are regular citizens, 8 people who are legislators. They sort of fought over those lines, but ultimately the process got kicked over to Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, which was part of the way that they had set up the system. And it was that Supreme Court that was able to then designate, a set of experts to draw the lines. So in the end, if you think about the whole spectrum of what Virginia had to go through, even though they had a lot of fights in their half and half commission, ultimately it was a more fair process because it got kicked to their state courts. All right, and let's see if I can get my slides to go. All right, so I want to just focus on one state, California, which sort of has what I think of as being the at one end of the spectrum, right? Which is a system where there is more independence than not. So the way that they choose their commission is useful as a learning process. So everybody is allowed to apply. And then, sorry, let me just make sure it's going. The people are screened for qualifications and conflicts. Step 3, there's an entity in California. We chose the Bureau of Auditors, who then conduct interviews, and they narrow the pool of thousands down to 60, 20 Democrats, 20 Republicans, 20 others. Some of the criteria that they are specifically instructed to look for are people who have the ability to be impartial, people who reflect or represent the diversity of the state, but also people who have the ability to appreciate the diversity of the state, right? And then people who bring skill sets that are going to be relevant for the commission. And that could be, actually having some background in civil rights law. It could be having touched maps before or drawn maps, but it could also be people who have run a good meeting and they know how to handle public input. Number 4, legislative leaders exercise the strikes. So we gave legislative leaders an ability to do the thing that we thought they would best be able to do, which is do opposition research on the other side, and then decide who might be a dead ringer for the other side and exercise the strikes of the pool, kind of like a jury voir dire, right? So they remove a certain number of people from the pool, and then we put people into this bingo ball. Literally, it is a bingo ball cage. And then the first 8 people are drawn randomly. And then those people then look at who's remaining in the finalist pool, and they pick the last 6. I won't go through sort of what ended up happening, but suffice to say that in this process, 30,000 people applied. There were 14 people who were chosen as commissioners. The first time the commission convened itself, it decided that it wanted to hold as many meetings and public hearings as possible. It ended up holding more than 100. The second time around, a similar kind of very, very public process where you see the maps on screen drawn in real time, nothing behind closed doors. So when we look at different states, one of the questions that Carol posed was, what kind of models should we be looking at in other states? What can we learn from what works and doesn't work in other states? I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but you want to think about conflicts of interest. I would say the strongest you're going to find are in the California and Michigan laws. They tend to include not only the people who would run for those lines, but also people who are in their sphere of influence. So think party leaders, think consultants, campaign staff, think legislative staff, think lobbyists. And in California's case, they also excluded major donors. That's a question. Second, how many commissioners and what should the partisan balance be? Increasingly, what we see is a model where you have an equal number or a close to equal number of Democrats, Republicans, and what I'll call not affiliated or unaffiliated with either of those 2 major parties. That generally also includes third parties, but it could include people who are not registered with either party or any party.
Before you go on, Kathy, I'm just pausing you to say that your slides aren't progressing.
Oh dear.
So we're still seeing the first slide with all this.
Okay, well, that would be helpful if let me just.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I appreciate that. Let me just go back. That's weird because I see it progressing, but apparently it's not. So, okay. Wow, all that, and I was just like talking to myself, huh?
No, we were happy to hear you. We just
Okay.
couldn't see what you were saying and
Oh, that's right.
wanted to flag
Okay.
that.
I'm just gonna, I'll go forward and then we can always go back if there's a need to have more detail. Sorry. Let's try this again. I'm not sure why it's sometimes just in practice, it works perfectly. And then once it's live, it doesn't. Okay. So can everybody see a screen where it looks like it's like a sieve with a bunch of dots coming down and then groups of people who are being picked who are Democrats, Republicans, and others?
Yes.
That's what you see? Cool. Okay. So the number of commissioners, I think, is a significant starting question. Like, do you want to have an equal number? And you'll see in California and Michigan, there's a relatively equal number. The big question is whether you have more or less people who are not declared made one with the two major parties. There is an older model, and Carol, you mentioned in the 1990s there was a bill that was introduced that had two Republicans, two Democrats, sorry, who were picked by legislative leaders, and then those four people then turn around and look at a pool of people and they choose one more person who is unaffiliated with those two major parties. That was the model that was very popular in reforms that were adopted in the 90s. And that includes Arizona, and then later on, Idaho, Montana, Washington. What I'll say is we've seen that that can lead to a situation where that one person who is not affiliated with the two major parties ends up getting caught in a really very ugly battle between the two parties, and where unfortunately it can lead to continued partisan fights that last through the entire decade. Okay, so I'm just going to say that it doesn't always happen. So in Arizona, litigation lasted for a whole decade. In Washington state, not so much, right? So it can lead there. By comparison, in California and in Michigan, there's been litigation, but it sort of got resolved very quickly, over and done with, state moves on. Okay, so just thinking about the who picks, in some states, you have an outside body that is responsible for screening, and then you have some way of cutting the strings, right? And so in Michigan, they have all of the commissioners being randomly drawn. In California, you have the first 8 who are randomly drawn, and then the last 6 are picked, right? So different states do it differently, and I'll just note that there are some states where Colorado has a very complicated system where the legislative leaders get a role in picking some of the people. We tend towards advising, if at all possible, try to have people who are independently chosen, not chosen by the legislators, because I guarantee you get into a whole morass of partisan interests, because those people who are chosen by the politicians are on their cell phone constantly checking in with their bosses about whether the maps that are drawn meet with their satisfaction. Okay, do you see a picture of Rosie the Riveter?
We do.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so what should the powers of the commission be? So again, we talked a little bit about this. Some of them give their commissions the final ability to approve the maps. Others say, nope, you got to kick it to the legislature, or the legislature gets to have, they can do an up or down vote and reject the maps that are drawn by the commissions. I think we generally would tend to say, look at the commissions that have final approval power. You don't want to go through a whole process only just to have your legislature ignore the drawing of maps by the commission. There are all sorts of questions that you'll need to think about in terms of what level of approval for the final vote to adopt the maps, and some requirements thinking about, like, how do you make sure that the staff and the consultants meet the same kind of fairness and lack of conflicts of interest that you might apply to your commissions. And then lastly, you just want to be sure that there's an ability to defend the maps in court. And you want to think about what role should the courts have. Saying it explicitly will help, because as we know, and I'll talk about a little bit more, there are some cases that are coming down the line that could put the role of the courts in jeopardy if you don't say it out loud. Okay. Mapping criteria, I'm just going to say very quickly, there are some states, California, Colorado, Michigan, are worth looking at because they have very clear ranked mapping criteria. So 1 before 2, 2 before 3, 3 before 4, that makes it very clear to the commissioners what they need to do. Almost all of the states that we look at have as their top criteria adherence to the state and federal constitutional requirements, adherence to the Federal Voting Rights Act. The challenge is that with the erosion of the Voting Rights Act, you may also want to bring in language that says, here's what we mean by protection of minority voting rights, even if the Supreme Court ends up gutting some parts of the Voting Rights Act. Okay. Here are some of the things that you have been struggling with in various bills, as other states have as well. Do you want to have an outright ban on political gerrymandering? There is language that you see in many state constitutions that talks about do not favor or disfavor incumbents, parties, or candidates. I've listed some of the states that have that language, but that's almost in many of the newer adopted language, this is a given, this anti-gerrymandering language. The second question is whether you want to have some kind of more formulaic or specific requirement that there not be partisan gerrymandering. In Michigan and Ohio, you have language that talks about what partisan gerrymandering is, how you measure it, how you identify it. Missouri also has that kind of language, but I will say Missouri went one step further and in a way almost too specific, because as with anything, the math and the thinking around the social science around this is ever changing. So you may not want to lock in, my example is you don't want to lock in faxing as your technology, knowing that you may have new technology that comes along that's better, and you want to be a little bit open about what the measure is going to be. Then lastly, do you want to have language that specifically bans consideration of where incumbents live, or bans, other things that may be used to put the thumb on the scale in favor of incumbent protection? We think it's very important to have language that protects and requires a consideration of community of interests testimony and consideration of where they're located, right? I think many places they also will say, can we also consider city and county divisions? Depending on where you're at, counties may be the identity of a place. Depending on where you're at, cities or even neighborhoods may be what you want to consider. Giving some flexibility to the state, to the commission, to think about communities of interest, counties, cities, and neighborhoods is one way that we think you allow that testimony to come forth, and you allow it to be respected depending on the geography of where you're at. Okay. I won't go into this. I know that there's a lot of discussion about how you define communities of interest. Suffice to say, we think that it is very important to enshrine that, if possible, because of what Salewa talked about, right? Which is, if you reorient the thinking of whoever's drawing those lines to really take in the testimony of people in the neighborhoods and the places where they live, you change it from being a top-down to a bottom-up consideration. And that's fundamental to how we rethink redistricting. We also think that compactness, if you have it, should be at the bottom of the list. We think that there's a lot of reasons why it can create some weirdness, right? If anybody wants to raise their hand or put in the chat, I guess there's no chat, but in the questions, what this shape is, right? This is a city, right, in Pennsylvania, and you can tell the city is not compact. So if you start to require compactness, which is districts that are drawn in perfect squares or perfect circles, you end up not recognizing the natural geographies that people have built their lives around. And so compactness can be something that is not always a neutral criteria and can be used against the changes that people really want to respect when it comes to redistricting. Okay. Think about your public hearings, and we think that there's a number of good models. There are specific initiatives or laws where they not only set up the public hearings in stages for when you have public input, they also ban discussion that happens outside of the hearings. And they require, at the very least, that mapping platforms and data be made available to the public, that you don't charge them for it, that it's something that people can viably be able to access and then submit maps on. This, I think, this third bullet point should actually these days become the minimum, the floor, because it was so widespread in the 2021-22 process. I think that it's a given that we should expect that any law should include that. All right. Some things to just think about in terms of the Supreme Court and where it's at. There are two cases that are right before it. Allen v. Milligan, which could take another bite out of the protections that are provided by the Voting Rights Act, and Moore v. Harper, the question about whether state legislatures will have the ability to check, whether state courts will have the ability to check state legislatures, or if state legislatures just get to draw lines in an unbound way. The one thing I will say that could protect against Moore v. Harper, but we'll have to wait to see what the Supreme Court says, is if there are laws that are adopted that say we specifically grant the state court the ability to review these lines and to, if they find something is unconstitutional, to come up with the remedy. Okay. In Congress, I will say that unfortunately, even though there are some great bills that have been circulating, including the Freedom to Vote Act, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Right now, I don't know that we can reasonably expect that Congress will come up with a solution, though we can continue to try to push our congressional members. So a lot of the action that we're going to expect to have solutions from has to happen at the state level, and that's where you all come in. And with that, I hand the baton back. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So much important information that you shared there. I think one of my big takeaways are, if you're looking at models and places to look at best practices and learn from, Colorado, California, and Michigan have models that folks should look at so that we can learn from, so that we can continuously make the process in Pennsylvania for us better and better over time. Thank you so much for that information. And I get the pleasure next of introducing our next panelist. Jonathan Cervas began at Carnegie Mellon University after receiving his PhD in political science from the University of California, Irvine. His bachelor's degree, also in political science, is from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His dissertation is in historical quantitative look at the Electoral College and its consequences. In 2021, Jonathan served as the redistricting consultant for the Pennsylvania Legislative Reapportionment Commission. That's that 5-member body that draws the state house and state senate lines right here in Pennsylvania. The final plan received a bipartisan vote and was upheld unanimously by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And with that, I introduce you all to Jonathan.
Thank you so much. And those final words you said, the unanimous affirmation by the Supreme Court was something we were really proud of. I've heard, I don't have a formal presentation. I don't have a PowerPoint. It is such a beautiful PowerPoint, but I'll try to just sort of be a little bit informal. And I have some notes, but I'm going to kind of wing it a little bit and just say that there's a textbook about redistricting, and the subtitle, it's called Redistricting. And the subtitle of it is The Most Political Activity in America. And I actually brought that book to Mark Nortenberg at the beginning of the process, and I tried to warn that this was going to be a difficult task. And so sort of skipping to the end and just saying, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania doing a unanimous affirmation. That's an elected body of Democrats and Republicans, and them all agreeing that our plan was legal. Was really, sort of a crowning moment for us, and getting a bipartisan vote on something that's considered the most political activity. It's not easy to do, especially since I don't believe what we have are bipartisan gerrymanders in Pennsylvania. And so now I want to backtrack to what I wanted to start by saying, which it was that these are huge tasks to do this kind of work, and it's impossible to do it without good teams. And I was part of an excellent team in Pennsylvania, led by Mark Nortenberg, the former chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh, who is, in my mind, one of the best people I've ever met as an individual. and also a talented academic, a thoughtful person, somebody who really cares about the public, and somebody who could really sort of, strip away his own political preferences in order to do the best thing for Pennsylvania voters and citizens, something I aspire to myself. And we had a very small but good team that Mark put together. Our chief counsel for the commission, Rob Beyer, is a well-known attorney in Pennsylvania, former judge of the Commonwealth Court, also a wonderful person and a great lawyer. And his law firm also brought on Laminsk, who was incredible, talented, understood and knew all the redistricting litigation that had happened throughout all of American history. Anne Marie Sweeney, who was our administrator, who was more than just an administrator or secretary, sort of ran the entire operation, kept track of everything, did scheduling. Cannot overstate the importance of these things, to have a good team. And of course, our team extended beyond just the people who were on our sort of small staff. Included experts that we brought in, academic experts who I'm most familiar with, people like Lee Hekadorian, who's a geographer, Matt Barretto, Ray Block Jr., Trey Hood, David Lublin, who came in as experts on the Voting Rights Act, Brianna Remster and Roy Kramer, who came in, advocated for prison gerrymandering reform, Chris Warshaw, who was an expert on partisan gerrymandering. And I could not leave off of that list my friend John Nagel, my colleague John Nagel, who is a physicist at Carnegie Mellon and a member of Fair Districts PA, who happens to be an expert on partisan gerrymandering sort of in his free time. And having all of these people available to us allowed us to get a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. And I need people to understand, in Pennsylvania, sort of the process for state legislative redistricting is essentially teams of individuals, and not just a commission who can be thought of as one. You have the House Democrats and the House Republicans and the Senate Democrats and the Senate Republicans, and they all have full-time staff who are on the payroll throughout the entire decade and are paying very close attention to demographic changes, population changes. They probably are, preparing maps for 2030 today. It's a year-round, decade-long process for these caucuses, and the neutral chair comes in just a few months before our final product is supposed to be done, with not nearly the amount of staff or resources, and a much shorter timeline by which to do these things. And so we had a huge learning curve from the very beginning, stepping in and trying to kind of compete against these caucuses that have their own sort of, and that's not a comment on them individually, but they all have their own self-interest as leaders of caucuses, of political parties. And so what I'm trying to say is that teams are really important. And the biggest lesson I learned from Mark Nortenberg was put good people around you if you want to be successful. And I carried that on into my work in New York. And I created a similarly sized team, lawyers, people who are good at communication, people who could understand communities of interest in the areas that those would have been really important in, and just people to sort of have their ears to the ground to sort of understand what needed to be done. The circumstances were very different in New York, and I'll sort of get into that in a few minutes. But nonetheless, the importance of a team is just critical for any kind of success. And of course, we remiss not to say that the sponsors of this forum were also critically important for my own personal understanding of the communities of interest in Pennsylvania. Also, not just me, but the commission, Mark individually, and the entire commission. I have lived in Pennsylvania for a while, for many years of my life, and it turns out that I know almost nothing about the state, right? You can live in an area for your whole life, but I'm very familiar with the streets around me and in the neighborhoods around me, but I don't know anything about Philadelphia or Lancaster or any of these other areas, right? And Mark has lived in Pennsylvania for something like 40, 50 years and felt the same way. And so having these experts and community leaders was so important for developing what I think of are very good maps. And so let me get into that a little bit and just start talking a little bit about the specifics of what happened in Pennsylvania and New York. And so the first thing that I was asked to sort of speak to was what were the challenges in balancing the priorities in Pennsylvania maps. And so one thing I'll say is that in the end, the maps we developed for both the state house and the state senate achieved very high marks on traditional redistricting criteria. In fact, we were able to improve upon, I believe, every single criteria found either in the Constitution or sort of what academics or people who do redistricting know as traditional redistricting criteria. We did better on every single one of them. And we did that while how I believe as creating racial equity, creating maps that have racial equity. And that we did that while ensuring that the voter strength remained high and that individuals' votes were undiluted. So that's a challenge, right? To sort of juggle all the criteria found in the Constitution and still be able to deliver those kinds of results. And we're in a period of time where there's a lot of uncertainty, as the last slide on Kathy's beautiful slide deck showed. It said we're in a weird time with litigation. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the law actually is. And that comes from both our state court and from our federal courts. So first, let me address racial equity. And I think it was a priority of the majority of the members of the Pennsylvania Commission and the staff of the commission to create racial equity. The problem with creating racial equity in today's world with the Supreme Court is that there is a prohibition on using race in a predominant way stemming from our 14th Amendment. And so an overemphasis on race could doom a plan. In fact, our House plan was petitioned to the US Supreme Court on that very reason for using race in a predominant way. Now, I don't think we did use race in a predominant way, but nonetheless, the litigation that is currently out there in the Allen versus Milligan case suggests that any use of race may be inappropriate in redistricting. And if that's true, it makes creating racial equity very difficult, especially given the fact that we have historic redlining and sort of segregation from long ago that persists today in ways that lead towards sort of in a natural but realistically very unnatural sort of discrimination against racial minorities. And so on that backdrop of the legal concerns, we had to figure out ways to create racial equity without, sort of slamming against the law. We also had the issue of partisan bias, or to use the phrase of fair districts, fair districts. People want fair districts. I actually don't like, I've told Carol this before, I don't like the word fair. And the reason I don't like the word fair is because I think that almost everybody has a different definition of what fair is. So my goal as a redistrictor is to draw plans that don't dilute anybody's vote. So similar to what the Voting Rights Act does, is it ensures that minority voting rights are not diluted. I think we should try to be trying to achieve the same thing for all voters. All voters should have an undiluted vote when it comes to the choice of representative. And so that being said, in 2018, as I'm sure most of you know, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down the state's congressional districts using a provision of the state constitution that says elections must be free and equal. Now, this is a provision that dates back to 1790, and one of the first Pennsylvania constitutions, and from the work of one of the founding fathers, James Wilson, who was a Pennsylvania native and one of the most small d Democratic founders, advocated for a popular vote instead of the Electoral College. But it was his writings that influenced the creation of a free and equal clause. And so we knew when we were creating these plans that the court had previously struck down plans as partisan gerrymanders. So we certainly didn't want to create a partisan gerrymander. But what did that mean when it came time for us to create maps and try to lead to undiluted votes? And as Kathy mentioned, there are a variety of metrics by which social scientists have used to judge whether a vote has been diluted in an ever-changing list. But the court wasn't quite clear exactly what it was looking for in its 2018 decision. Now, we have a much clearer view of that, post-redistricting 2020, particularly because there were seven justices who delivered opinions regarding the congressional districting. There were 7 different opinions that were delivered. So we have a very good understanding of what the court was looking for now after the fact, but at the time, we didn't quite know. Now, because the Supreme Court unanimously affirmed our plans, I think it's fair to say that our plans were consistent with the state constitution. So we're very proud of that. Now, I know a lot of people feel very good about the Pennsylvania House of Representatives map, but feel a little bit less good about the Pennsylvania State Senate map. And I don't know that I share those concerns. I'm very proud of both maps. Let me put it that way. Now, let me just give a little bit of data. I reran these this afternoon. But John Fetterman, who won the U.S. Senate seat. So one of the ways we can judge fairness, it's very hard to look at the elections at the level of, say, Pennsylvania House of Representatives or Pennsylvania State Senate, because a lot of the seats are uncontested. There's actually no votes cast at all. And in the state Senate's circumstance, half of the districts are not even run in each election. So in 2022, only half of the districts had elections. So we can project in the election results for the statewide elections to sort of judge what fairness is like. And so John Fetterman, who won the U.S. Senate race, won 107 out of 203 House districts. So slightly more than the amount of House seats won by Democrats in this 2022 election. That's an indication that the map is fair. Fetterman won the majority of the votes statewide, and he won the majority of the House seats. And by the way, that's 52.7% of all seats in the House. Now, in the Senate, Fetterman won 28 out of 50. That's 56%. He actually won a higher percentage of the state Senate seats. And so for those who say that the state Senate still exhibits a significant amount of partisan bias, it actually appears that it has less partisan bias than the House map. The House map is almost certainly still favoring the Republicans in terms of the translation of votes into seats. Similarly, Josh Shapiro won 124 out of 203 House districts. This is important because Shapiro won a higher percentage of the overall statewide vote, and he won a higher percentage of the House district, meaning that the districts were responsive to changes in the voting preferences of the state. Very important thing. You want maps to be undiluted, and you want maps to be responsive. Those are 2 critically important things in any map. Anyone 32 out of the 50 state Senate maps, 4 more than Fetterman. So again, responsive and I believe fair. I know I'm probably running a little bit here, but let me just sort of move on to New York and just say what are the differences. And let me start with the obvious difference. In Pennsylvania, the process by which we got maps was done by a political commission where 4 of the 5 members were members of the legislature. In New York, I was the special master appointed by the court. And so ultimately the court had to approve a map. And that was the process. I didn't have to answer to any politicians. I got emails from politicians. Politicians made comments in the newspapers and on TV, but they didn't get a vote in the process. I believe that the map in New York, both the congressional map that I drew and the state Senate maps, they were constructed under very similar circumstances. The things that I used to draw the map, the ideas, the concepts, the criteria were almost identical to those in Pennsylvania. They're almost identical to what the court did in North Carolina and Virginia. Both maps that were drawn by my mentor, Bernie Groffman, who was on my team in New York. And so we used the same principles to draw the New York map. And I believe we came up with maps that, again, were not dilutive. The Republicans happened to do particularly well in the 2022 election in New York, and they won a number of seats. Still, there are a large number of very competitive seats in New York, especially in the congressional district level, that in 2024, it very easily could be under the same map that Democrats could pick up 4 or 5 seats just by flipping a couple of thousand votes in each district. So those are, very important things. Let me sort of, I don't want to go too long because I know we have questions and answers. I can see them building up on my screen here. And let me just say that some of the things that were really kind of critical, important, both in New York and in Pennsylvania, for people like me who had the obligation or the burden of drawing these maps, is that, we got to take public input from community members. I recognize a lot of the participants in this because I got maps from you or suggestions. Those are good. The best way to be effective as somebody who is a citizen who wants to have their voice heard is to offer very specific feedback. So once a map has been delivered, a draft map, to say, it would be better if the line went this way or you included this community in this district and included this community over here in another district. Those kind of mappable changes are easy to implement. When the feedback is sort of more broad, it's very hard to implement that in a map that has rippling effects. So when you make one change, it causes changes throughout the entire map. And so, very specific mappable changes can really lead to the ability for somebody like a special master to actually make changes to the map. We made a lot of changes from the draft map to the final map in New York. I think we did a better job in New York than we did in Pennsylvania. I think we are currently writing a post sort of report on Pennsylvania legislative redistricting. And one of the things that I think is a big takeaway is that the draft map should be closer to the final map so that there was only small changes from that point, or at least that give a longer period from the time that a near final map is given to the time the final map is going to be voted on, so that there aren't inadvertent changes that end up harming communities sort of by accident. I think that happened in a few places in Pennsylvania, and I think we regret that. But let me stop. And I know that there's lots of good questions, and I think we could have a nice conversation.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I'm going to take it back to one of the first things that you said and shared with us. Put good people around you if you want to be successful, I think is one of the biggest takeaways from what you shared today. But then also, specific mappable changes and just around the entire process, a little bit more time for feedback, specifically around the final version of maps, may have given you some really important information to make sure that you could have the a version of a map that you feel incredibly confident about. But just as, you know, one of the advocates that worked on this, just thank you so much for everything that you were able to do during this process. You mentioned Chairperson Nordenberg earlier, Judge Byers. It was an experience being able to really give feedback and feel like that feedback was taken and received by the LRC, and just deeply appreciative of all of the leadership from our now Speaker McClinton, at the time Majority Leader McClinton, and everyone else who really just spent time on this process and getting us to the maps that we have today. So we are going to turn over to one of my favorite parts of panel discussions, and just being able to answer some of the questions that you all have sent throughout the time that we've been here today. And so my first question is actually going to be for Kathay. You shared an amazing map earlier that kind of outlined the different states I was going to say in Pennsylvania, the different states in the United States and where they fall on the spectrum of completely political legislators that are drawing maps to a very independent commission. So we had someone who asked a little bit about Florida. So just love to hear about where on that spectrum Florida fits.
Florida has an initiative process. So again, I'm just going to note that some of these states, they have an initiative process, which makes it life a little easier in terms of adopting the lines that, or adopting the law that you want. But what Florida has is a rule that says the lines shall be drawn using these rules, and it forbids the legislature from engaging in partisan gerrymandering. But ultimately, it is the legislature that is drawing the lines. It requires the legislature to hold hearings around the state. It has to abide by these rules, these criteria that say the Voting Rights Act has to be respected, right? Communities of interest testimony has to be taken in. The challenge is that in the first round, so in 2000, I want to say 11, when Florida first adopted those lines, it was freshly adopted constitutional changes. The legislature does what it does, which is they're like, okay, we held all these hearings around the state, and look, this map got introduced by some innocent student. And so we're going to adopt that one. And what it turned out was that through litigation, because the maps that were drawn were not, in fact, fair on a partisan scale, the court said, okay, we're going to, because it says that the legislature cannot come up with the lines themselves, they have to take it from public input. They peeled open all of the communication, the emails, the secret texts that legislators were sending back and forth. And what they found out was that the legislature, a certain party within the legislature, had commissioned political operatives to draw their maps, and then they had it submitted under this young man's email. And once all that got peeled away, then the court said, nope, you violated the rules. We gave you a chance, one bite at the apple. They gave them a second bite at the apple. And then finally the court said, forget it. You all can't be trusted. The court is going to redraw the lines. This time around is a little different. And I'll just say, DeSantis and the craziness that's happening in Florida has meant that the governor is much more willing to kind of push the boundaries of what is allowed and not allowed. He bullied the legislature into adopting a set of maps that I think everybody would agree are unconstitutional, except for his political cronies. And there's a big question about whether either the federal courts or the state courts will find that there's a problem and order those lines to be redrawn. And the problem in Florida is first bite of the apple has to go back to the legislature to redraw those lines. It takes quite a bit for the court then to say, no, we're going to take that away from you. So the big thing in Florida is that they have mapping rules and criteria. They require the courts to be there to enforce them. And if it turns out that the courts can't or won't, then you have a situation where you're stuck with the maps that you've got.
Thank you so much, Kathay. And thank you for that question about Florida and what that commission looks like. The next question, there's a couple of different questions in the chat about AI and the use of AI to draw the maps and the use of AI to actually choose potential citizens for the commission itself. I'm going to actually turn it over to Jonathan to talk a little bit about the maps, the use of AI, particularly in drawing the maps themselves.
Okay, so I hear this a lot, that computers can be used to sort of solve the problem of legislators' self-interest, that we're going to use computers, AI, algorithms, et cetera, to draw districts. The problem with AI is it's only as good as what you feed into it. And redistricting is complicated, it's complex. So there are more potential redistricting plans than there are atoms in the universe, right? So no computer on Earth can enumerate every possible plan. It's a problem. It's not a problem that computers can solve, really, right? It just there's just too many possibilities out there. And I don't know any social scientist, I don't know anybody involved in redistricting who thinks that using computers is actually a good way of doing redistricting. And I'm not an AI expert, even though I'm at Carnegie Mellon. Some people think I should be. I'm not an AI expert, so I don't know all of its, potentials. But human beings still know more than computers, and human beings are still critically important for redistricting. Now, let me, try to strip away the AI and just kind of think about computers and what computers do and how computers can harm redistricting. So, it goes both ways. They can help and they can harm. So one way in which it can be shown that a plan is a partisan gerrymandering is by drawing a large number of plans that are compliant with legal standards on whatever state you're in. This is what they did in Pennsylvania to prove gerrymander in 2018, where we're going to draw a large number and then show the plan that was enacted by the legislature is sort of in the tails of a distribution on partisan fairness, that it's very unfair. So that's the good use of these computers in redistricting. Now, let me say the downfall of this. So in a state of Pennsylvania, when you're drawing a 203 seat House of Representatives plan, if you allow computers to draw the map, what you end up getting are maps that are on average very unfair on partisan bias, that they have high levels of partisan bias favoring one political party, and that they are very discriminatory against racial minorities. And so a blind computer, so this is also what some people suggest we ought to be doing as far as the VRA is concerned, that we ought to be drawing blind with no data. And that makes no sense. What we ought to be doing is drawing plans that adhere to traditional redistricting criteria, so that they don't split municipalities, they don't split counties, communities of interest are kept together, but also make sure that votes are not diluted, make sure that minority votes are not diluted, make sure that Democratic votes are not diluted, make sure that Republican votes are not diluted. And I think that we can do that, but if you just allow computers to sort of do their own thing and say, draw plans that are compact, you're going to end up in a situation where maps are very biased and very discriminatory. And so I caution against the automated use of computers for redistricting.
Yeah, I add just two things. As Jonathan says, algorithms are ultimately just an expression of the choices that human beings make. So, and the data is only as good as what is out there. Okay, so we're already hearing about AI and the fact that if there is just information out in the universe, the AI is just collecting it and replicating it in conversational format. So similarly, if we know and recognize that there are racial inequities and other kinds of inequities built in, problem is that the data that it's collecting is only going to reflect and reinforce those inequities. Second thing is, in a lot of litigation, we use computer-generated maps not to show what the perfect map is, but to show if you were to try to comply with all of these criteria, what are the range of choices and what are you likely to see? And the reality is that if you set like 5 criteria, 10 criteria, 16 criteria, 1,000 criteria, the computer can generate 1,000 maps, 1,000,000 maps that satisfy all your criteria. So somebody still has to decide which of those maps am I going to choose? It's still a human choice. And so what we think is that in addition to, there's not such a thing as a perfect map. What we do think is that the little d democratic process of having a deliberative, listening, participatory process is a healthy thing for our democracy. You listen, you give and take, and you learn to live with each other, right? And if along the process you say, oh, I didn't know that about Lancaster, I've learned something new. Or, oh, I didn't realize that Fairfield is changing, I learned something new. That process is one that we think is worthy of the messiness that happens when you bring a lot of human beings together to have a conversation about our future. In some ways, it's sort of saying, let's acknowledge that this is ultimately about trying to create a system of governance for humans by humans, and you can't farm it out to a computer.
Thank you both so much. And I think that a lot of the challenges and a lot of the benefits, like creating a lot of different options at one time that you can use as a model to judge against as humans, likely apply to choosing commissioners as well. You know, there's a limitation of AI, there's a limitation of data, and that limitation is us as humans and the bias that we all come with. And so thank you for those questions about the use of AI. We're going to take it to another state. There's actually 2 questions about Michigan that I'm going to pose to both of our panelists. The first comes from Agatha. I know that in Michigan, the requirement to honor communities of interest appear to be manipulated by the prior opponents of the commission to organize testimony that advocated packing. How can this be addressed? And the question I'm going to tag on to the other side of that as well is regarding racial equity. Can any of the panelists speak to what happened in Michigan with regards to race?
I'll take a stab, and then Jonathan, if you want to add, or vice versa, either way. I'm happy to go either way. Okay. So the first question about preventing manipulation. So in a number of states, you will see language that defines what a community of interest is, and then also says what it's not, right? And I think that that's actually kind of important if you're going to define it. So it can include, for instance, a consideration of where your transportation facilities are, what are, people who share similar interests and, need for work opportunities, right? Access to media or learning about agricultural areas, right? But what it's not is to be defined based on relationships to political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. I think that when you do that, what you will see is there will always be a universe of people who try to game the system. It's human nature, unfortunately. You can't stop it. But what you can do is create guardrails where you can evaluate the maps to see if that kind of infiltration has happened. And if it has, the maps can be challenged and potentially changed to correct for that, right? That's what we really need to do, is just make sure that you account for the attempts to try to manipulate the system and guard against it. I'm going to pop into, maybe I'll pop into the Q&A, or can I? Let's see, maybe I can. I'm going to try to pop into the Q&A, some definitions of communities of interest that you can look at from other states. Okay. Second question about what happened in Michigan about racial minorities. So let's specifically talk about the Black community in the Detroit area, which had elected a certain number of Black representatives. And the commission had kind of these different goals that it was trying to do. One of them was to try to draw districts that would result in partisan districts that were drawn with a partisan balance that was close to what the overall state partisan balance was. Okay. And in pursuing that goal, the question was, what do you do with populations in urban areas that are densely packed, that tend to be very heavily Democratic voting? but also are people of color. And if you distribute them more evenly so that you can have more Democratic seats, you could also be splitting up those communities. Without judgment about whether what they did was right or wrong, that was the dilemma that they faced. And they made some choices about, what they were looking for and what they were going to value based on a lot of the testimony. And I think what you see is an honest attempt to try to both create opportunities for many emerging communities of color and also try to find some balance that creates a more reflective partisan balance. In Michigan, what ultimately happened was that the control of their state legislature did flip from being Republican controlled to Democratic controlled. That is partly just a reflection of where the demographics are going, right? But it is certainly the case that people would say that the districts made that possible because they were no longer locked in to protect certain incumbents and give them an easy win.
So you'd be interested to know that the community of interest, based on the number of feedback that we got from the commission, the most important community of interest in Pennsylvania is, I'm looking at my map, Cumberland and Perry County. That's based on the number of submissions from the public, the most important community of interest is the combination of Perry County and Cumberland County. And now you're saying, why? What? Because community of interest can be defined however anybody wants them to in order to accomplish whatever goal they want to accomplish. And so after we delivered draft maps for the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, the map had paired off incumbents in that area in a way that that party leader, the caucus leader, would have liked to see us separate those into two. And so we got about 25% of all comments that came after the draft map were about those two counties. I guess what I'm saying is, and it actually relates to New York too, and something Kathy said earlier is that there's a lot of times it's hard for a commission or a legislature or a special master to know when you get communication from the public, whether it's honest, this is my community, we feel strongly about this, it's important, here are the reasons why, versus here is an effort by an organized group to try to put as much mail as possible in order to attempt to create some change, whether it's good or bad for voters. Another example of this from New York was we made the decision to draw Manhattan congressional districts in a way that was different than what had been done in previous decades. Dating back to at least the 1970s, the congressional districts were divided in Manhattan so that the west side of Manhattan had its own congressional district and the east side had its own. At some point in time, that probably made a lot of sense because the neighborhoods were very different and you're combining communities in a way that made a lot of sense. But fast forwarding to 2020, as we looked at census data, particularly of growth of minority groups in Southern Manhattan and Western Brooklyn, it made a lot more sense to draw the districts in a way where you had a lower Manhattan, sort of a mid Manhattan and an upper Manhattan, with the lower Manhattan moving into the Asian communities in Brooklyn, creating what it has not been reported by any reporter so far as I know, but actually created an additional majority minority district than what the legislature had created by combining those communities and ensuring that they had their voices, sharpened instead of diluted. And so where I'm getting at is after the fact, this new community of interest propped up, this east side, west side Manhattan community of interest. And sure, these are communities. Upper West Side and Upper East Side are different neighborhoods and Manhattan. The question is, in a congressional district that's over 700,000 people, where do you put the 25 or 30,000 people that are in these neighborhoods? Who should they be combined with? It turns out that the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side have way more in common than the Upper West Side and in Brooklyn. And so if you're going to have provisions about communities of interest, we have to have ways of collecting this data. Now, this is where computers can be extremely valuable. There are organizations, are groups that have started to collect communities of interest, including one I'm affiliated with, representable.org. And there, somebody can go on and map their community. And then we can have aggregates of what people say is their community of interest before any mapping is done, before there's the opportunity to manipulate the feedback that's being given, so that somebody who's doing redistricting has a mappable sort of map of communities by which they could use in order to actually make that provision or provisions regarding communities of interest, effective. And so I'm not against community of interest per se. I'm against using them after the fact to justify political goals, absent actual intention to help voters.
Thank you so much. And I think that same kind of theory is a theory that a lot of folks, including Fair Districts and my coalition members, took to the process this year of how do community members define what their community looks like themselves, and how is that used to inform the map drawers, because you can't be from everywhere in Pennsylvania at the same time. And so just being open to listening as map drawers and as experts and community members being open to participating in the process that way, I think we've seen be incredibly effective. So there's one more Michigan question I want to squeeze in before we move on. The Michigan reform was radical in at least one way. It promoted proportionality over some traditional criteria. What are your thoughts on preserving the primacy of splits, compactness, and other traditional criteria over measures of equity and outcome like proportionality, responsiveness, competitive districts, and opportunities for minority representation? And I think both of you all touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to ask the more poignant and specific question.
Yeah, as a value judgment, I would say trying to hold on to districts that are compact, trying to hold on to protection against splits above all else. Those tend to be, from my perspective, an attachment to artificial definitions of what makes a community work or what makes a district work. So I think all the other criteria that you talked about, communities of interest, thinking about the Voting Rights Act compliance, thinking about kind of just, to be honest, I know this sounds a little bit mushy, but I really do think that, if you think about communities of interest as the way that people organize themselves in the years in between the two bookends of redistricting, right? If you think about like a community that's organizing to fight the closure of a school, right? Where is that community coming from? Where do they gather? What brings them together? Why is that school so important to them? Can we draw, where they physically live? Because if you can, that becomes something where the history, the things that they celebrate together, the shared culture or language, all of those are things that define that community, and it's independent of redistricting, right? You could say the same thing for like communities that are impacted by, whether they have access to clean water or a great park, or, want to make sure that their legislator is responding to a particular issue. And those issues are really what I think define. And then if you can say that they live in a certain place and they share a lot of characteristics, all the better. And somebody, I think, down the line asked, what can we do between now and, when an initiative pops up or some other measure, is referred to the ballot, right? And what I would say is keep having these conversations at the local level. Frankly, those free mapping tools are still out there, which are fantastic, that where you can actually say, hey, we're all gathered together to talk about the impact of X, right? And here's where we live. Here are the things that bring us together. Here are the shared things. Create that documentation, bring that into the conversations that you have with your local elected officials, because that is also documentation that you will hold on to when it comes to redistricting, to say, this is not just a contrived thing that I came up with in order to justify the way a map was drawn after the fact. No. This is how our community organizes in the years in between redistricting, and that's why it's reliable.
Thank you so much. I can't emphasize that enough. Jonathan, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit less enthusiastic about these communities of interest, because I agree. I agree 100% with what Kathay says. So it's not a matter of, as a principle, absolutely, we should be developing maps that are developed based on the organization of people in their interest. I just really worry about the way that they're manipulated. Even if they're done ahead of time, when there are, if the criteria that's being forced by the courts to be used is, say, communities of interest, it's going to give incentive for people to manipulate it even ahead of time. And so I really am concerned that it can be used in ways that harm rather than help. So if we can figure out how to use them in ways that help, then I'm 100% for it. The benefit, or the nice thing about using the traditional criteria like county and municipality splits is that those lines don't change, and it sort of constrains the sort of, like, you can't guarantee that you're going to have, I'll just use the term fair map, as opposed to my more favorite undiluted map, which somebody asked that, by the way, they're the same thing, they're just different terminology. Because for those who paid close attention, the argument that was being advanced by the House Republicans of Pennsylvania was that fair meant that it should be whatever is the middle of an ensemble of maps that's created, whatever the outcome of the political outcome in the middle, the mean, is what's fair, which in Pennsylvania means a lot more Republican districts than Democratic districts, even when people vote for Democrats. But so I do believe that there is a rule for the traditional criteria in constraining the sort of more egregious gerrymanders. And I'm hopeful that we can figure out a way to use communities of interest in a positive way, but I also worry about them being manipulated. And I think it's something that we have to think about really carefully over the next 5-6 years, particularly as the U.S. Supreme Court chips away at our voting rights and minority voting rights, because communities of interest is going to be a nice sort of fallback for ensuring that those communities get proper representation. But guarding against the sort of manipulative, the Perry Cumberland County sort of community of interest that isn't really a community of interest situation.
Thank you so much. So what I'm hearing is that loving the Yankees does not make us a community of interest, So I actually heard that once. So that was a definition of community of interest that someone tried to advocate for, which is just very interesting. So we're going to do one last question before I leave you all with action steps. So there's a potential for SCOTUS to decide not just that the VRA does not ban racial gerrymandering, but that paying attention to race and redistricting in order to prevent dilution of minority voting power itself constitutes racial gerrymandering and is banned by the VRA. Similarly, there's a potential that they will decide that the independent state legislature doctrine would make it impossible for a state legislature to delegate map review power to the courts, even by a duly passed law or state constitutional amendment. So the question here is, do you see any defense against this at the state level, or is the federal Supreme Court of the United States reform the only hope? And you have to answer this question in like 2.5 minutes.
Okay, so for the Supreme Court to go so far as to say, even if you put a protection into a state constitution, even if you say that a state court is the entity that interprets your state constitution and enforces, that interpretation on a state legislature, you can't do that, I think would basically throw our country and all of the checks and balances that we have got built in and 200 plus years of blah, blah, blah in the trash can. And so even though I know that people are really worried that our Supreme Court has lost its mind, I would say that I'm going to hold out hope that we have not just put our entire country's democracy into the shredder. And what that means then is that at the very least, our state constitutions still matter. Chief Justice Roberts said that, right? He said that state constitutions matter. So if that's the case, and there are values that we specifically want to put in, not generically, but specifically want to put in, I think that is a place that you can put to protect those rights. And in lieu of Congress taking action, which right now they're having a hard time doing, then I think that the best place that we can do it is in our state constitutions. How many seconds left?
We still have like a minute left, Jonathan, if you want to jump in here.
Moore versus Harper is a very important case. It's a redistricting case, right? It's North Carolina redistricting. And so it's special to us redistrictors, but it has broader implications for our democracy. What my prediction, I'm actually optimistic on this. I think the court's going to rule 7-2. First of all, there's a question about whether they're going to rule on this case at all. I hope they do. In fact, I think it's critical that they rule on this case. I think it would be a mistake to call it moot and throw it out. This is an issue that needs to be addressed immediately, whether state courts have a role to play in our federal elections. The reason is because we have a 2024 election coming up in which there will be state legislatures who even more forcefully want to overturn the will of voters. And they need to be told by this U.S. Supreme Court that they cannot do it. State courts can interpret their laws and they can prevent legislatures from doing whatever they want. I think that there's going to be support of that. So assuming that they actually rule on this, and I hope they do, I think it's going to be 7-2. And I don't think there's 2 votes that we're never going to get on the U.S. Supreme Court on this issue. But I think that there's going to be a strong majority saying, of course, state courts can be a check on our legislatures. And so I'm optimistic and hopeful. And I think it's basically, it has to happen if we want to save our democracy.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of the 191 participants who have hung in with us. I think we got over 250 folks who joined. There's so much appreciation for the panelists inside of the question and answers. So please check those out, panelists. In addition to, there may be a couple of questions we didn't get the opportunity to actually answer here. Please rest assured that if you know friends, family, folks that would have loved to get the information that you got today but weren't able to make it, that you will receive a follow-up email with the recording of this video, and we can try to answer as many questions as possible in that follow-up email as well. And for all of my folks who put things inside of the question and answers earlier about what do you do between now and the next redistricting cycle? What is going on in Pennsylvania? How do you get involved in creating more fair districts? You are in greatest luck because this is the first of many of these discussions that we're going to host as a redistricting table. Thank you so much, Carol and Fair Districts, for your leadership. Thank you to all of the other amazing coalition members, Committee of 70 and Draw the Lines Pennsylvania, the NAACP, PA State Conference, League of Women Voters. And again, thank you to the team at Pennsylvania Voice. And thank you so much to the amazing panelists, Jonathan, Kathy. It was so amazing to learn so much from you all today, and just always grateful to be in deep relationship with you all as we try to make sure that the maps across the country are as strong as they possibly can be. And so it has been great to be the host for our evening session this night. Please look out for follow-up emails about future sessions that we'll be hosting to talk more about redistricting. There's so many topics that could have been their own entire panel. And so I'm excited to continue this conversation, because between now and the next redistricting cycle, as Kathy said earlier, we have 10 years of data to collect so that we have the best informed LRC and process around congressional redistricting that we can possibly have right here in Pennsylvania. So have a good evening, everyone. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.